I found myself in a dire situation, financially struggling and feeling hopeless. Then my imposing landlord presented an unexpected proposition that changed everything. This is a true story. I never imagined that life would lead me to this moment. Perched on the brink of despair, grasping the final remnants of my dignity. Not long ago, all felt secure. I possessed a job, a home, and a marriage that, though not flawless, provided a sense of stability. Yet now, all was drifting away like grains of sand slipping through my grasp. Invoices accumulated more swiftly than I could manage. My bank account felt like a harsh punchline, revealing figures that only underscored my sense of powerlessness. Job applications went unanswered, rejection emails cluttered my inbox, and every lead I pursued led to yet another dead end. I attempted to conceal my irritation from Daniel, my husband. Yet the strain between us had become intolerable. He had changed completely from the man I married 5 years ago. In those moments, he would embrace me after a challenging day, reassuring me that everything would turn out fine. However, recently, he hardly seemed to notice me. His words felt icy and remote, as if I had merely transformed into yet another complication in his already overwhelming existence. When I shared the news of yet another unsuccessful job interview, his response was minimal. "I'm giving it my all," I had said, my voice trembling. He let out a weary breath, massaging his temples. "We can't survive on mere attempts, Emma. The bills are relentless." It wasn't the words he chose, but the way he delivered them. As if he had already lost hope in me. Agnes. That night, I found myself wide awake, gazing at the ceiling, consumed by a sense of defeat. The rent had fallen behind schedule. The landlord had previously issued us a warning. We had only a few days remaining before eviction turned into a genuine threat. I considered reaching out to my parents, yet I found myself unable to do so. The burden of confessing my failure was overwhelming. The following morning, after Daniel departed for work without even a farewell, I came to my conclusion. I needed to have a conversation with Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter commanded attention with his formidable presence. Statuesque, robust, and perpetually stylish. He bore himself with a subtle command. He possessed multiple properties in the vicinity, and his manner of managing affairs revealed a clear sense of wealth and influence. I had hardly exchanged words with him prior to this, apart from the standard tenant-landlord dialogues. I rapped on his office door, my hands quaking with anticipation. As he opened it, his dark eyes scrutinized me intently, as if he were already aware of the reason for my presence. "Emma," he said with a casual grace, leaning against the doorframe. "I was curious about when you would arrive." His words sent a chill coursing through me. I managed to put on a slight smile. "I simply require a bit more time to arrange the rent. I lost my job and things have been, I understand," he cut in. "I maintain a record of my tenants. It seems you've faced some challenges for a period now." Shame seared through me. I despised that he had taken notice. "Listen," I took a deep breath. "If I could just get an extension." "I promise I will," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Emma, landlords cannot thrive on mere assurances." I sensed the lump in my throat swell. I had nothing more to give. "I can't extend the deadline for you," he persisted. "However, I can present you with an alternative." His gaze held onto me, twisting my stomach in a way that was both unsettling and intriguing. I anticipated the direction this was heading long before he uttered a word. "You're a beautiful woman," he remarked nonchalantly, as if he were commenting on the day's forecast. "And I hold a strong belief in equitable exchanges." My body became stiff. I instinctively stepped back, my mind racing. The words lodged in my throat. "There's no pressure," he said, raising his hands in feigned innocence. "Assistance is required. I can provide it. No obligations involved." No obligations involved. As if that improved anything. I turned and walked away. My heart racing. As soon as I stepped outside, a sense of relief washed over me, and I felt like I could finally take a deep breath again. Yet, the burden of his proposal lingered with me as I returned home. Daniel returned home late that night. I had stayed awake for him, yearning for a sign of reassurance. A hint that he still held some affection. Yet, when he entered, he hardly recognized my presence. I remarked gently, "You're late." Work dragged on, he grumbled as he loosened his tie. I wanted to trust him, yet there was an unsettling quality in his voice. "Daniel, are we all right?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. He gazed at me then. Truly gazed at me for the first time in weeks. Yet, rather than the comfort I sought, all that met my gaze was fatigue. "We're fine, Emma," he said, though it felt like a deception. I nodded. Yet a sense of emptiness lingered in my chest. That night, my mind was consumed by Mr. Carter's offer. Considering how effortless it could be to agree. Only a single time. Simply to navigate this chaos. Yet, the idea turned my stomach. I promised myself I would discover an alternative path. I had to. I attempted to cast aside the conversation with Mr. Carter. Yet it lingered like a shadow, infiltrating every thought. The most challenging aspect was the allure it presented in that brief instance of hopelessness. The rational side of me shouted that it was incorrect, yet another part, the one submerged in financial despair, kept murmuring, "What options do you possess?" As time went on, the situation continued to deteriorate. I sifted through a myriad of job postings, dispatching applications, yet no responses came my way. I parted with old clothes, jewelry, anything I could spare. Yet it hardly made a dent in covering groceries, much less rent. Daniel hardly uttered a word to me these days. He returned home late, perpetually weary, perpetually aloof. There were nights when he simply didn't return home. I began to observe subtle details. His phone perpetually muted, much like his evasion of my touch. The faint trace of a fragrance that wasn't mine lingering in the air. I reassured myself that I was just being overly cautious, that the pressure was causing me to perceive things that didn't exist. Yet, beneath it all, I was aware. Something that existed between us had already shattered. 3 days later, the eviction notice arrived. "This is your last notice. No further extensions." My stomach churned as I perused the paper, my hands trembling so violently I could scarcely grip it. I considered reaching out to Daniel, but what would be the purpose? He didn't care in the past. And he certainly wouldn't care now. That night, as I found myself in solitude within our dimly lit apartment, the weight of reality enveloped me like an overwhelming tide. Lacked funds. No employment. None assistance. I had pleaded, struggled, and exhausted every effort I could muster. Yet, nothing had proven effective. Then, like a harsh reminder, Mr. Carter's words reverberated in my mind. "Fair exchanges. No conditions apply. Asterisk asterisk." I gazed at my phone, my fingers poised above his number. A heavy, unsettling burden pressed down on my chest as I grappled with my own thoughts. I had devoted my entire existence to the conviction that I would never waver in my principles. That I would never allow myself to find my way into a situation like this. Yet, I had also never felt this level of desperation. "Initiate the call." The phone hardly had a chance to ring before he picked it up. His voice flowed effortlessly, filled with understanding. "Emma. I had been anticipating your arrival." Shame seared through me. Yet I forced it down. "I require assistance." Oz. "In that case, I understand." The setup was finalized. Details are unnecessary. Simply a comprehension. My hands trembled as I concluded the call. My heart raced with such intensity that I feared it might shatter my ribs. I remained still, enveloped in quietude for what felt like an eternity. Grappling with the notion of whether I could truly see it through. I convinced myself it would only happen once. Simply to navigate this. Merely to endure. Yet, beneath the surface, I was aware of the reality. There was never a moment that could be labeled as merely once. The remorse began even before the event unfolded. I sensed it seeping into my mind, coiling around my thoughts like a constricting vine. I reminded myself to push thoughts of Daniel aside, to focus on the task at hand, and not dwell on what was coming next. I remained loyal to him for 5 years. Yet, was he truly loyal to me? I wished to have faith that he truly had. Yet, the uncertainties echoed more powerfully than my refusal to acknowledge them. Upon encountering Mr. Carter once more, an overwhelming sensation enveloped me, as if I were traversing a path from which there would be no return. His presence was all-consuming. His confidence remained steadfast. He didn't inquire whether I was certain. He was already aware of the answer. As soon as it ended, a wave of nausea washed over me. I found it impossible to face my own reflection. My body felt foreign, as if I had exchanged a part of myself for something fleeting, something that would ultimately hold no significance. Yet, I also experienced a sense of relief. The rent was taken care of. The eviction had ceased to be a looming concern. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of buoyancy. I convinced myself it was finished, that I would never repeat the past, that I could return to my life as though nothing had transpired. However, I realized my mistake. For as soon as I stepped back into my apartment, Daniel was there, waiting for me. The expression in his eyes revealed that he was aware something had shifted. Daniel's gaze held onto me longer than it typically did, examining me in a manner he hadn't in quite some time. His gaze held an unusual quality. Not the typical fatigue or apathy, but rather a sense of doubt. At first, he remained silent, simply observing me as I navigated the apartment, feigning that everything was just as it should be. Yet, I sensed it. The change that had taken place between us. The burden of my actions lingered thickly in the atmosphere. And even though he possessed no evidence, an instinct within him felt it. I maintained my distance, fearful that if I got too close, he would notice the guilt etched across my features. Yet, he remained silent that night, more so than he typically did. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sense of tranquility and precision. "Where were you today?" My stomach churned. I had stepped out. He nodded slowly, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Where exactly?" He paused. That sufficed for him. He refrained from forcing the issue, yet the harm had already been inflicted. The subsequent days were excruciating. He seemed more frigid, more removed. I believed I had concealed my guilt effectively, yet the tension between us became palpable, almost stifling. He ceased his inquiries, yet I sensed them lingering in the atmosphere each time his gaze met mine. I attempted to remind myself that he had been the one to pull away initially. That I wasn't the sole keeper of secrets. The fragrance, the sleepless nights, the manner in which he had exited our union long before I had come to my conclusion. Yet, that awareness did nothing to diminish the guilt gnawing at my core. And then I discovered the message. It was right out in the open. His phone remained on the counter. The screen glowed with a notification he had neglected to dismiss. A name I was unfamiliar with. A message I wish I had never encountered. "Last night was truly remarkable. When will I have the pleasure of your company once more?" Asterisk. My chest constricted. The words swirled together as I struggled to make sense of them. Every part of me shouted that this was a blunder, that there must be some other reason behind it. Yet, I was aware of the truth. I had been aware for some time. I placed the phone down gently, as if any sudden movement might worsen the reality I was facing. I anticipated the surge of anger, the full impact of betrayal crashing over me. Yet, all I experienced was a profound numbness. When Daniel walked in that night, I chose not to confront him immediately. I wished he would say something first. To at least feign that he wasn't deceiving me every time he claimed he was working late. However, he chose not to. He hardly glanced in my direction. I was the one who spoke first. "Who is she?" He stood still. His expression remained unchanged, yet the rigidity of his body revealed all I needed to know. He didn't even inquire about the topic I was discussing. He simply understood. "Emma. Do not deceive me." I interrupted him. "Not at this moment." He let out a weary sigh, dragging a hand across his face, as if the mere act of speaking had already drained him. "It's not what you imagine." I chuckled, yet there was an absence of amusement in it. "It's never the case, is it?" Quietness lingered in the space between us. At last, he let out a breath. "I never intended for it to unfold this way. It simply happened." The words pierced through, yet what stung more was his unsettling calmness. As if he had already come to terms with it. It was as if he felt no remorse at all. "What is the duration?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. He paused. That sufficed as a response. I sensed a fracture within me. The final connection that kept me intact broke, and in an instant, I found myself unable to contain the truth any longer. I said, "Me too." His head jerked up. After months of waiting, I finally had his complete focus. "Excuse me." I compelled myself to meet his gaze, even as my heart raced wildly. I accomplished that as well. Surprise flashed on his face, swiftly giving way to a deeper, more sinister emotion. "With whom?" I gulped. "Mr. Carter." The stillness that ensued was stifling. His expression contorted into an enigmatic mask. A blend of skepticism and fury. "You're joking," he said, yet he was already aware that I wasn't. I shook my head. I found myself in a state of utter desperation. We were on the brink of eviction. I was at a loss for what to do next. His laughter cut through the air, tinged with a bitter edge. "Therefore, that renders it acceptable." I tightened my grip. "Do you really believe that what you did is any better?" He moved nearer, his gaze searing into my own. "At least I maintained my integrity." The words struck with the force of a blow. My breath hitched. Yet I stood my ground, unwilling to divert my gaze. "At least I did it to endure." I responded sharply. "What's your reason?" For a brief instant, silence enveloped us both. We simply remained in place, gazing at one another. We both came to the same realization simultaneously: there was nothing left worth fighting for. All the love we once shared, all the trust we painstakingly constructed, has vanished. Daniel shook his head, taking a step back. "I am unable to accomplish this." I anticipated what was about to unfold even before he uttered a word. "I am departing." I refrained from intervening. I remained composed. I simply nodded, for deep within me, I had already sensed that this was the inevitable conclusion. As he packed a bag and walked out the door, I remained on the couch, gazing at the void he had just vacated. I desperately wished to hold on to the notion that my actions wouldn't alter anything, that I could mend it, that we could transcend it all. Yet, the reality was that we had both been shattered long before this moment. The stillness in the apartment was overwhelming. Daniel had left. And for the first time in years, I found myself completely alone. Enough of the endless waiting for his return. No longer will I feign that everything is all right. Only I stand here, facing the outcomes of my decisions. I devoted an immense amount of time rationalizing my actions, persuading myself it was a matter of survival, that I had no alternative. Yet, as I sat there, Gazing at the vacant spot that once held Daniel's belongings, the reality was undeniable. I had forsaken my own truth long before I turned my back on him. Survival extended beyond mere financial concerns. It was a matter of dignity, of clinging to my true self even in the bleakest of times. And I had allowed that to fade away gradually, persuading myself it was the sole path ahead. I reminisced about the initial moment I sensed everything unraveling, when Daniel began to distance himself. And the burden of our challenges grew overwhelming. I had held him accountable, felt a deep resentment towards him for not embodying the man he once was. But had I truly remained the same woman he wed? Or had I transformed as well, in ways I wasn't even aware of? The last several months transformed me into a person I hardly recognized. A woman who had lost hope, who had given up on herself. A woman who acted from a place of urgency rather than empowerment. I had to navigate my path home. I immediately reached out to Mr. Carter. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice when he answered, like he already knew why I was calling. However, I interrupted him before he had the chance to speak. "It's finished," I declared resolutely. "Stop." Then a leisurely chuckle. "You obtained what you sought, and now your task is complete." I choked down the shame that seared in my throat. I erred. I won't be able to do it again. He let out a sigh, a hint of mild disappointment in his demeanor. "Your decision." I ended the call before he had the chance to say anything more. It wasn't just about him. It was about taking control of my life again. About no longer being a victim of my own bad decisions. I dedicated the following weeks to a process of reconstruction, focusing on both my financial stability and my emotional well-being. I accepted any work opportunities that came my way, juggling various gigs, working independently, doing whatever it takes to keep going. It was quite a challenge. At times, it seemed utterly unachievable. Yet, each dollar I earned independently, every minor advancement, felt like a fragment of my essence returning to me. Daniel failed to make the call. He failed to send a message. And I also didn't make an effort to connect. I had devoted so much time attempting to cling to something that was already shattered, yet now I grasped the meaning. Some things are not destined to be repaired. At times, the most beneficial action is to release your grip. 1. As the evening settled in after a lengthy shift, I stood before the mirror, truly observing my reflection for the first time in months. I failed to notice the anguished woman who had previously made an irrevocable choice. I observed someone more powerful. A person who had endured unimaginable trials and yet remained resilient. The past was indelible. Yet, it didn't need to shape my identity. I discovered through difficult experiences that desperation drives individuals to actions they never imagined they would take. Betrayal often exists in shades of gray. Occasionally, the most regrettable decisions stem from a certain mindset of suffering, not spite. Yet, I had also discovered that redemption can be achieved, not by means of apologies, not by way of regrets. Yet, amidst transformation, I was no longer that woman. And I would never be again.